The sharp sound of skin striking skin echoed through the first-class cabin. Passengers gasped as Vivian Jackson, a 72-year-old black woman in simple clothes, touched her stinging cheek. The flight attendant sneered, unaware the elderly woman she just slapped owned 60% of the entire airline. Before we dive into this shocking true story, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. This story about hidden power and justice served will change how you see the world around you. Are you ready to witness how an act of discrimination led to an airline's complete transformation? Let's get started. The morning had started like any other for Vivian Jackson. At 78 years old, the billionaire founder of Jackson Aeronautics had seen it all during her 5 decades building her empire from nothing. But today was different. Today, she wasn't arriving at the executive terminal in her private jet. Today, she was flying commercial, on her own airline, incognito. "Are you sure about this, Grandma?" Terrell had asked that morning as she deliberately selected her most modest dress, a simple navy blue cotton number that had seen better days. "You could just send one of your quality assurance teams." Vivian smiled as she removed her diamond earrings and replaced them with simple pearl studs. "Numbers on a report don't tell the whole story, child. If I want to know how my airline truly treats its customers, especially ones who look like me, I need to see it with my own eyes." She'd built her reputation on attention to detail. Jackson Aeronautics hadn't become the 5th largest airline in America because Vivian trusted others to tell her what was happening in her company. She'd clawed her way up from nothing, facing discrimination at every turn. Now, with a net worth of $4.3 billion, she still believed in seeing things firsthand. Terrell was supposed to accompany her on this undercover journey, but an emergency with his daughter's school had pulled him away at the last minute. "Go," she'd insisted. "Family comes first. I've been flying alone since before you were born." Now, standing in the security line at Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, named partially after her late husband, Vivian observed. She'd booked her ticket under her maiden name, Vivian Carter, using an old driver's license she'd kept for sentimental reasons. Her simple clothes, minimal makeup, and deliberately weathered handbag completed the disguise. To anyone looking, she was just another elderly black woman traveling alone. And that's precisely when she noticed it. The TSA agent at the checkpoint waved through 3 white passengers with minimal screening. When Vivian approached, the same agent's demeanor changed instantly. "Step aside for additional screening, ma'am," he said without making eye contact. "May I ask why?" Vivian inquired politely. "Random selection," he replied curtly, though it was obvious to everyone within earshot that nothing about this selection was random. 20 minutes later, after a thorough and unnecessarily invasive pat-down, Vivian collected her belongings. She made mental notes of names, times, and badge numbers. Not for retribution, but for education. Each instance would become a teaching moment. At the gate, Vivian observed the boarding process. The gate agent smiled broadly at white passengers, engaging in friendly banter while checking their boarding passes. When black passengers approached, the smiles tightened, conversation became minimal, and scrutiny increased. When her boarding group was called, Vivian approached with her first-class ticket. The gate agent, a young white woman named Katie, raised her eyebrows skeptically. "First class is boarding now," Vivian said gently, extending her boarding pass. Katie examined the pass with obvious suspicion. "Are you sure you're in the right line? This is for first class." "Yes, I'm aware," Vivian replied, maintaining her composure. After a moment of hesitation, Katie scanned the pass. "I guess it's correct," she muttered, as if Vivian had somehow ended up in first class by mistake rather than choice. As Vivian walked down the jetway, she felt a familiar heaviness in her chest. After decades of success, after building an airline worth billions, after having her name on airports and buildings, she was still seen first and foremost as an old black woman who couldn't possibly belong in first class. Aboard the aircraft, Vivian settled into seat 2A. The first-class cabin was half empty, yet the flight attendant, whose name tag read Allison Cooper, managed to avoid eye contact with Vivian entirely while warmly greeting every white passenger. "Can I get you something to drink before takeoff?" Allison asked the white businessman across the aisle from Vivian. "Just water, thanks," he replied, not looking up from his laptop. Allison poured his water with a flourish, then turned away without acknowledging Vivian's presence. "Excuse me," Vivian said gently. "May I have some water as well?" Allison turned, her smile instantly transforming into a tight line. "We'll be serving all passengers after takeoff," she said crisply, despite having just served the man across the aisle. From the galley, Vivian could hear whispers. "Why is she in first class?" Allison muttered to another crew member. "Probably using her grandson's buddy pass or something." The other flight attendant, a tall man whose name tag identified him as Brandon Matthews, glanced at Vivian then shrugged. "Just serve her after takeoff with the others," he said, making no attempt to correct Allison's behavior. Vivian took out her reading glasses and a small notebook, beginning to document her observations. If her company had a racism problem, she intended to root it out completely. Each slight, each microaggression, each violation of the service standards she herself had written, all of it would be addressed. What troubled her most wasn't Allison's behavior. There would always be individuals with prejudice. What troubled Vivian was that Allison's supervisor, Brandon, observed the discrimination and did nothing to correct it. That suggested a systemic problem, one that would require systemic solutions. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Vivian gazed out the window at the airport bearing her family name. She'd faced discrimination throughout her journey from a poor neighborhood in Birmingham to the boardrooms of America's business elite. But she'd never stopped fighting. And she wouldn't stop now, even at 78. The engines roared to life, and Vivian settled in for what would prove to be one of the most consequential flights of her remarkable life. The seatbelt sign dinged off as the aircraft reached cruising altitude. Vivian observed the cabin crew spring into action, their movements practiced and efficient. Allison moved through the first-class cabin with a tray of hot towels, distributing them with a warm smile to each passenger, until she reached Vivian. "Here," Allison said flatly, practically dropping the towel onto Vivian's tray table. "Thank you," Vivian responded with the graciousness that had become her trademark throughout her business career. "Kill them with kindness," her mother had always said. But document everything, Vivian had learned to add. In the row ahead, a white woman in her 40s received a warm towel with a flourish. "Is this your first time flying first class with us?" Allison asked her cheerfully. "Yes, I usually fly Delta," the woman replied. "Well, we're so glad to have you with us today. Let me know if there's anything special I can do to make your flight more comfortable." The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Vivian felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the cabin temperature. Was this what passengers who looked like her experienced on her airline? The thought made her stomach tighten. 30 minutes into the flight, the cabin grew cool. Vivian pressed the call button. 5 minutes passed before Allison appeared, her expression suggesting Vivian had committed an offense by requesting service. "Yes?" Allison asked, her tone clipped. "I wonder if I might have a blanket," Vivian requested politely. "It's a bit chilly." Allison's lips pressed into a tight line. "I'm sorry, we're out of blankets in first class." Vivian nodded, making another note in her book. "I understand. Thank you anyway." Not 3 minutes later, Vivian watched as Allison approached the white businessman across the aisle, the same one who'd received water before takeoff when she hadn't. "Mr. Porter, I noticed you might be cold. Would you like a blanket?" Allison offered with a solicitous smile. "That would be great, thanks," he replied. Vivian watched in disbelief as Allison retrieved a blanket from a compartment that was clearly full of them. The businessman caught Vivian's eye and had the grace to look embarrassed. From the galley, Vivian could hear Allison speaking to Brandon. She hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but their voices carried. I hate working first class when they let these people up here, Allison muttered. They don't belong, don't know how to behave, and never tip anyway. Just get through it, Brandon replied, neither agreeing or disagreeing, but certainly not correcting what was clearly inappropriate conversation about a passenger. Vivian continued taking notes, her handwriting still elegant despite her age. This wasn't merely about one flight attendant's bias. This was about a culture that permitted such attitudes to flourish unchecked. The meal service began. When Allison reached Vivian, she practically threw the tray down. "Chicken or pasta?" she asked without making eye contact. "Chicken, please," Vivian replied. "And may I have a glass of white wine?" "ID?" Allison demanded immediately. Vivian raised an eyebrow. "I'm 78 years old. It's policy to check ID for all alcohol requests," Allison insisted, though Vivian had observed her serving drinks to multiple white passengers without asking for identification. Vivian provided her ID, which Allison scrutinized as if suspecting forgery. When she finally poured Vivian's wine, it was barely a splash in the glass. A few minutes later, as Vivian attempted to eat the unappetizing chicken, the businessman across the aisle accidentally knocked his elbow against his drink while reaching for his phone. The contents splashed onto Vivian's seat and the edge of her dress. "I am so sorry," he said, genuinely mortified. Before Vivian could respond, Allison rushed over. Instead of addressing the spill, she immediately said to Vivian, "You need to be more careful about where you place your things. You're blocking the aisle." Vivian, who had done nothing wrong, looked at Allison with surprise. "I believe the gentleman accidentally spilled his drink," she said calmly. The businessman, looking increasingly uncomfortable, nodded. "It was entirely my fault," he confirmed. Allison's face tightened, but she began cleaning up the spill, making a show of how inconvenient it was. "These seats are expensive, you know," she muttered, seemingly implying Vivian shouldn't be in one. The businessman extended his hand to Vivian. "James Whitaker," he introduced himself. "I'm truly sorry about that. Please let me pay for your dry cleaning." "Vivian," she replied, shaking his hand. "And don't worry about it. Accidents happen." As Allison departed with a huff, James leaned closer. "Is it just me, or is the service a bit uneven today?" Vivian gave a small smile. "You noticed?" "Hard not to," James replied. "I fly a lot for work, tech industry, and I've never seen anything quite like this." As they continued talking, Vivian was impressed by James's genuine interest in her perspectives. When the conversation turned to aviation, Vivian carefully modulated her expertise, but couldn't help sharing insights gained from decades in the industry. "You seem to know a lot about airlines," James observed. Vivian smiled. "I've been around a while. You pick things up." Their conversation was repeatedly interrupted by Allison, who found numerous reasons to check on James while ignoring Vivian. The contrast was so obvious that even James began to look uncomfortable. During a lull, Vivian discreetly opened her wallet to retrieve a business card for James. As she did, a family photo slipped out. James politely picked it up, glancing at the image before handing it back. "Beautiful family," he commented, then paused. His eyes narrowed slightly as he noticed something in the photo. Is your grandson wearing a Jackson Aeronautics junior pilot uniform?" Vivian tucked the photo away with a small smile. "He wants to be a pilot someday." James studied her face with new interest. "Forgive me for asking, but are you connected to Jackson Aeronautics in some way?" Before Vivian could answer, Allison appeared, practically inserting herself between them. "Sir, can I get you another drink?" she asked James, her back entirely to Vivian. "No, thank you," James replied coolly. "But I believe this lady might like a refill on her wine." Allison's shoulders stiffened. "I'll check back later," she said, walking away without acknowledging the request. James shook his head in disbelief. "That's beyond unprofessional. Yes, Vivian agreed, making another note in her book. Yes, it certainly is. The fasten seatbelt sign illuminated with a soft ding as the aircraft encountered a patch of turbulence. Captain Harris's voice came over the intercom, his tone calm but authoritative. "Folks, we've hit a bit of rough air. I'm turning on the seatbelt sign, and I need all passengers and crew to return to their seats immediately. Flight attendants, please suspend service and secure the cabin." The plane dipped and shuddered. A few passengers gasped as their drinks sloshed in their glasses. Vivian gripped her armrests, her face betraying no anxiety despite the pronounced turbulence. She'd flown through far worse in her decades in aviation. Brandon moved swiftly through the cabin, checking seatbelts and stowing loose items. Allison followed behind, her movements efficient but her manner brusque. 10 minutes into the turbulence, Vivian felt a familiar discomfort. The blood pressure medication she took each morning sometimes had inconvenient side effects, and today was proving to be one of those days. She pressed the call button, knowing she needed to use the restroom despite the seatbelt sign. Allison appeared, irritation evident on her face. "The seatbelt sign is on," she said before Vivian could speak, her tone suggesting she was addressing a disobedient child. "I understand," Vivian replied quietly. "However, I'm on medication that requires." "All passengers must remain seated," Allison interrupted. "It's a federal regulation." Vivian tried again. "I'm aware of the regulations. However, there is a medical necessity exception, and The bathroom is closed during turbulence," Allison announced, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "You'll have to wait." Vivian's discomfort increased, but she nodded, unwilling to create a scene. She made another note in her book, documenting the interaction. Less than 5 minutes later, Vivian observed a white man in his 50s, who had been drinking steadily since takeoff, stand up and head toward the bathroom. The seatbelt sign remained illuminated, the turbulence unchanged. Instead of the sharp rebuke Vivian had received, Allison approached the man with a smile. "Sir, the seatbelt sign is on, but if you need to use the restroom, let me help you," she said, gently guiding him toward the lavatory. The double standard was so blatant that several passengers exchanged glances. James Whittaker, across the aisle, shook his head in obvious disapproval. When the man returned to his seat, Vivian once again pressed her call button. This time, she was prepared to be more assertive about her medical needs. Allison returned, her expression even more annoyed than before. "Yes. As I mentioned, I have a medical necessity," Vivian explained calmly. "I observed that you allowed another passenger to use the facilities despite the seatbelt sign. I require the same accommodation." Allison's eyes narrowed. The other passenger was unsteady. "It was a safety decision." "I see," Vivian replied, taking out her phone and making a note. "And what safety consideration precludes accommodating my medical need while allowing his non-medical need?" "What are you doing?" Allison demanded, noticing the phone. "I'm documenting this interaction," Vivian replied. "You cannot record me without consent." Allison's voice rose sharply. "I'm not recording video or audio," Vivian clarified. "I'm taking notes about my customer experience, which is my right." This explanation only seemed to inflame Allison further. "Hand over that phone," she demanded. "It's against airline policy to use electronic devices to harass crew members." Vivian looked Allison directly in the eye. "I am not harassing anyone. I am documenting disparate treatment, which is neither against airline policy nor federal law." "Give me the phone now," Allison insisted, her voice rising. Several passengers were now openly watching the confrontation. James Whittaker unbuckled his seatbelt, preparing to intervene. "I will not surrender my personal property," Vivian stated firmly. "I suggest you consult your supervisor if you believe I'm violating policy." Allison's face flushed with anger. "You people always think the rules don't apply to you." The cabin went silent at the unmistakable racial undertone. Even passengers who hadn't been paying attention now turned to witness the confrontation. "Excuse me." Vivian's voice remained steady, but there was steel beneath the politeness. Instead of backing down or apologizing, Allison doubled down. "You heard me. First class isn't a place for people who don't know how to behave." James stood up. "That's enough. Your behavior is completely unprofessional." "Stay out of this," Allison snapped at him. "This is between me and her." Vivian continued calmly taking notes on her phone. The documentation would be valuable later, though she was beginning to suspect the situation had moved beyond a simple customer service issue to something that might require legal intervention. Allison, seemingly enraged by Vivian's composed documentation, did the unthinkable. She reached out and grabbed Vivian's arm, attempting to take the phone by force. Her grip was tight enough to leave marks on Vivian's thin skin. "Let go of me," Vivian said, her voice finally showing a trace of alarm. "You have no right to touch me." Several passengers gasped. One began recording with his phone. James moved into the aisle, ready to physically intervene if necessary. "Give me that phone right now," Allison demanded, her fingers digging into Vivian's arm hard enough to leave a bruise. The situation had escalated beyond anything Vivian had anticipated when she boarded the flight that morning. What had begun as a routine quality assessment had transformed into something far more disturbing, a physical confrontation that laid bare the ugliest aspects of her airline's culture. And things were about to get much, much worse. Vivian Jackson had faced discrimination her entire life. As a black girl growing up in 1950s Alabama, as the only female engineering student in her university class, as a young entrepreneur seeking funding in rooms full of white men who couldn't see past her gender and color. But never, in all her 78 years, had anyone physically assaulted her. Until today. "Remove your hand from my arm immediately," Vivian stated, rising slowly from her seat despite the illuminated seatbelt sign. At her full height, she stood barely 5'2", yet somehow commanded the space around her. Allison's grip tightened reflexively. "Sit down and give me that phone." "You have no right to put your hands on me," Vivian declared, her voice carrying through the now silent cabin. Decades of commanding boardrooms had given her a presence that belied her small stature and advanced age. What happened next occurred so quickly that later, when passengers described it to investigators, their accounts varied in detail but agreed on the essential facts. Allison Cooper, a flight attendant with 15 years of experience, completely lost her professional composure. Her right hand released Vivian's arm, drew back, and swung forward in a sharp arc that ended with her palm connecting forcefully with Vivian's left cheek. The sound of the slap seemed to echo in the stunned silence that followed. Vivian's head snapped to the side from the impact. Her reading glasses flew off, clattering to the floor. For a moment, no one moved. Not Vivian, not Allison, not any of the horrified passengers witnessing this unprecedented breach of professional conduct and basic human decency. Then, as if a spell had broken, the cabin erupted. "Oh my God! Did you see that? She hit her. I'm recording this. Call the captain." James Whittaker vaulted from his seat, positioning himself between Vivian and Allison. "Get away from her right now," he demanded, his voice tight with controlled fury. "What's your employee number? Your full name?" Allison seemed frozen, perhaps only now realizing the magnitude of what she'd done. Her face drained of color as she stared at Vivian, who was calmly retrieving her glasses from the floor. "I need your name and employee ID number," James repeated, his phone now recording. "Immediately." Other passengers had their phones out as well. In the age of social media, the incident was already spreading beyond the confines of the aircraft, though none of the witnesses yet understood just how significant this particular assault would prove to be. Brandon Matthews, the lead flight attendant who had ignored Allison's previous behavior, finally intervened. "Everyone needs to calm down," he announced, moving forward from the galley. "Let's not make this bigger than it is. She assaulted an elderly passenger. James retorted. How much bigger does it need to be? Vivian touched her cheek, which was reddening from the impact. Despite the attack, she maintained a composure that spoke of a lifetime spent controlling her reactions in hostile environments. I want her name and badge number, Vivian said quietly. And yours as well, she added, looking at Brandon. Your failure to intervene earlier contributed directly to this situation. Brandon blanched. Ma'am, I understand you're upset. Let me get you a complimentary drink and we can discuss this calmly. I don't want a drink, Vivian replied evenly. I want accountability. Allison seemed to be coming back to herself, though not in a way that improved the situation. She was being combative and refusing to follow crew instructions, she said defensively. I was maintaining cabin safety. The absurdity of this claim elicited audible scoffs from nearby passengers. The young man who had been recording since the arm-grabbing incident spoke up. That's not what happened and you know it. I have the whole thing on video. You can't record on an airplane. Allison snapped, seemingly unaware of the hypocrisy of her concern about rules after what she'd just done. Other crew members had gathered at the periphery of the scene, looking horrified but uncertain how to intervene. Among them, a young black flight attendant named Darius Johnson watched with particular concern. As Brandon attempted to control the situation by minimizing it, Darius discreetly approached Vivian's seat. With a meaningful look, he slipped her a cocktail napkin. When Vivian glanced down, she saw he had written his name, employee number, and personal cell phone, along with the words, I will be a witness. This isn't right. Vivian carefully pocketed the napkin, giving Darius a nearly imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. Brandon was still trying to manage the optics rather than address the assault. Ms. Cooper will take a break in the crew rest area, he announced. I'll be handling this section for the remainder of the flight. We apologize for the disruption. Disruption? James echoed incredulously. An employee physically assaulted a passenger. That's not a disruption, it's a crime. Vivian remained remarkably composed, though those close enough could see her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from a controlled anger that had been building throughout the flight. She had witnessed and documented multiple instances of discrimination before the situation escalated to physical assault. What she was experiencing was not an isolated incident but the most extreme manifestation of a culture that needed to be completely transformed. Reaching into her purse, Vivian retrieved an old-fashioned flip phone, the kind many seniors still preferred for its simplicity. She dialed a number from memory, turning slightly away from the ongoing commotion. Charles, she said quietly when the call connected. It's Vivian. I need you to make some calls. There's been an incident. The brief conversation was too quiet for others to hear in detail, but the shift in Vivian's demeanor afterward was subtle yet unmistakable. She went from victim to someone clearly accustomed to commanding situations. What would you do if you witnessed such blatant discrimination and assault on an airplane? Comment number 1 if you believe Allison should be immediately fired for her actions. Comment number 2 if you think the airline's entire culture needs to be overhauled. Hit that like button if you believe discrimination in customer service needs to be taken more seriously across all industries, and subscribe to see more stories of justice served in unexpected ways. What do you think happened next? Did Vivian reveal her true identity immediately, or did she have something more strategic in mind? The power shift that follows might surprise you. 30,000 feet above the Midwest, the atmosphere in first class had transformed. Though the "Fasten Seatbelt" sign had finally turned off, few passengers moved from their seats. The tension was palpable, an invisible current running through the cabin as witnesses processed what they had just seen. Allison had retreated to the crew rest area, her face ashen. Brandon attempted to resume normal service, his smile strained as he moved through the cabin offering drinks and snacks as if nothing unusual had occurred. Most passengers refused his offerings, some explicitly stating they didn't want service from someone who had enabled assault. Vivian sat quietly in her seat, her cheek still bearing the faint imprint of Allison's hand. She had declined ice when Brandon offered it, instead continuing to make notes on her phone with steady fingers. To casual observers, she appeared to be an elderly victim documenting an unfortunate incident. None except perhaps James Whittaker suspected she was actually executing the opening moves in what would become a complete restructuring of corporate culture. The first indication that something unusual was happening came 40 minutes after the slap. The aircraft's secure communication system chimed, signaling a message from company operations. Brandon, who had been avoiding Vivian's row, hurried to the galley to check it. When he emerged, his complexion had lost several shades of color. "What's happening?" Allison had ventured out from the crew rest area, her earlier bravado replaced by evident anxiety. Brandon shook his head slightly, then whispered something in her ear. Whatever he said caused Allison to grip the galley counter for support. "That's impossible," she hissed, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. How would they even know already? Brandon glanced toward Vivian with new uncertainty in his eyes. "They're requesting a full report on the incident. From all senior cabin crew. Immediately." "We can handle this," Allison insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. "It'll be my word against hers, and I've got 15 years with the company. Union protection. She's just some old woman making trouble." Brandon didn't appear reassured. "They're patch calling us from headquarters. This isn't coming from regular operations. This is coming from the executive floor." Allison's expression flickered between defiance and the first glimmers of genuine fear. "So what? We've had passenger complaints before. Corporate always backs us up." "Not like this," Brandon murmured. "They've never responded this fast. Something's different." As if to confirm his assessment, the aircraft's communication system chimed again. This time, it was the captain's voice that filled the cabin. "This is Captain Harris speaking. I need Mr. Matthews and Ms. Cooper to check in with ground operations immediately regarding the reported incident in first class. The rest of the cabin crew will continue service. We appreciate your patience during this time." The public announcement removed any possibility of containing the situation. Passengers throughout the aircraft who might not have been aware of the incident now turned in their seats, craning to see what was happening in first class. Allison's face flushed. "This is ridiculous. They're throwing us under the bus before even hearing our side." "Maybe you shouldn't have slapped a passenger," James Whittaker commented dryly from his seat. Allison shot him a venomous look but didn't respond directly. To Brandon, she whispered urgently, "We need to get our stories straight before talking to them." Brandon shook his head. "There are at least a dozen videos, Allison. We need to be honest about what happened." "Whose side are you on?" she demanded. "The side that doesn't involve losing my career over this," he replied grimly. While this exchange unfolded, Vivian observed silently. Decades of boardroom battles had taught her when to speak and when to watch. This was a moment for watching. In the galley, the secure line rang again. Brandon answered it, his responses limited to, "Yes, sir," and "I understand, sir," before he hung up, looking even more disturbed than before. "What now?" Allison asked. That was Mr. Lawrence. "From legal." "Legal? Already?" Allison's voice rose in pitch. How did this escalate to legal so quickly? Brandon looked directly at Vivian, then back to Allison. "They said the executive team is on an emergency conference call about this. Apparently, multiple videos are already circulating internally. They're asking if..." He hesitated. "If what?" Allison pressed. "If we knew who was on the flight today. If we'd received any special passenger notifications." Allison's brow furrowed. "What are they talking about?" "It's a regular Wednesday flight to Chicago." As the crew members tried to make sense of the rapidly evolving situation, Vivian's phone buzzed with an incoming text. She read it with a small nod of satisfaction, then returned the device to her purse. James Whittaker, who had been watching the crew's increasingly panicked consultation, leaned across the aisle toward Vivian. "I don't mean to intrude," he said quietly, "but I recognized your last name when I saw your grandson's photo. Jackson Aeronautics, it's your company, isn't it?" Vivian gave him a measured look, neither confirming nor denying. "The uniform your grandson was wearing," James continued. "It had the JAL insignia, Jackson Aeronautics lines. And now corporate headquarters is in an uproar over what happened to you. It can't be a coincidence." Vivian offered a small smile. "Mr. Whitaker, let's just say I take a personal interest in how this airline treats its passengers. All of its passengers." Understanding dawned on James's face. "They have no idea who they just assaulted, do they?" "No," Vivian replied simply. "They don't." As this quiet exchange concluded, the aircraft's communication system chimed yet again. This time, the screen in the galley displayed an incoming video call, something almost unheard of during flight. Brandon answered it, and even from her seat, Vivian could see several faces on the screen. She recognized all of them, her executive leadership team. Though passengers couldn't hear the conversation, they could see Brandon's face drain of color as he listened. When Allison pushed into frame to speak, the expression of the executives on screen turned even more severe. The call lasted less than 2 minutes, ending with Brandon looking physically ill. "What did they say?" Allison demanded when Brandon disconnected. "We're to document the incident in writing immediately and submit it before landing," he replied mechanically. "Both of us. Separately. They want unedited, uncoordinated accounts." "That's against union protocol," Allison protested. "They don't care about protocol right now, Allison." Brandon hissed. "Do you understand what's happening? Something is very wrong here." As the flight continued toward Chicago, a subtle but unmistakable shift in power had occurred. The crew members who had wielded their authority so confidently, and in Allison's case, abusively, now moved through the cabin with uncertain glances and whispered consultations. Meanwhile, Vivian Jackson sat quietly in seat 2A, the picture of elderly dignity, giving no outward indication that she controlled the fate of everyone on the aircraft. Throughout her life, Vivian had faced discrimination in countless forms. As a child in Birmingham during the height of Jim Crow. As a young woman trying to study engineering when universities barely admitted black students, let alone black women. As an entrepreneur seeking funding for her fledgling aviation company in the 1980s, when banks laughed at the idea of a black woman running an airline. "You know what the worst part was," she said to James, continuing their quiet conversation. "It wasn't the rejections or the closed doors. It was being treated like I didn't belong in the rooms where decisions were made. Like I was an intruder in spaces I had every right to occupy." James nodded. "And that's exactly what happened here today." "Yes," Vivian agreed. "Exactly that. The slap was just the physical manifestation of an attitude that says, you don't belong here. This space isn't for you. Will you sue?" James asked. Vivian gave a small shake of her head. "I'm not interested in lawsuits. I'm interested in change. Real, lasting change." Meanwhile, Darius, the young black flight attendant who had offered to be a witness, approached under the pretense of checking if Vivian needed anything. Bending close as if adjusting her tray table, he whispered, "Just so you know, ma'am," word spreading through the crew. "This incident has already reached company headquarters. They're saying it's a 5-alarm fire in corporate." Vivian nodded slightly in acknowledgement. "Thank you, Darius. I've worked here 3 years," he continued very quietly. "What happened to you today, it's not the first time I've seen it. Just the most extreme." "I know," Vivian replied softly. "And I'm sorry you've had to work in such an environment." "Most of us just keep our heads down," Darius admitted. "The system doesn't change if you complain." Vivian's eyes met his. "The system will change," she said, with such quiet certainty that Darius straightened, studying her face with new curiosity. As he moved away, the atmosphere in the cabin continued its transformation. The power dynamics had inverted completely, though the cause remained invisible to most observers. What had begun as a routine flight with Vivian being treated as an unwelcome intruder in first class had evolved into something much more complex, a moment of reckoning that would reshape an entire corporate culture. And as the plane began its initial descent into Chicago, the next phase of that reckoning was about to begin. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom as the aircraft began its final approach into Chicago O'Hare International Airport. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Harris speaking. We're beginning our descent into Chicago, where the current weather is 63 degrees with light rain. Local time is 3:22 in the afternoon. We'll be landing approximately 15 minutes ahead of schedule." There was a brief pause before he continued, his tone subtly different. "I've been instructed to inform you that when we arrive at the gate, all passengers are requested to remain seated. We have a special announcement that will be made at that time. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for arrival." A murmur spread through the aircraft. Such requests were unusual, typically reserved for medical emergencies or security situations. Passengers exchanged puzzled glances, while in first class, those who had witnessed the assault on Vivian began speculating in hushed tones. "Do you think it's about what happened?" a woman across the aisle asked her seatmate. "Has to be," he replied. "Nothing else would warrant this." Allison Cooper, who had been maintaining as much distance from Vivian as the confines of the aircraft allowed, approached Brandon with undisguised panic. "What's going on?" she demanded. "Why are they holding passengers?" Brandon's reply was terse. "I don't know any more than you do." "You must know something," Allison insisted. "You're the purser." "All I know is what I told you. They want our statements before we deplane, and passengers are being held for an announcement." He glanced toward the windows, then added ominously, "And there are vehicles on the tarmac." Allison followed his gaze. Indeed, 3 black SUVs with the Jackson Aeronautics logo were positioned near their arrival gate, an unusual sight that heightened her already considerable anxiety. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered. "It was just a difficult passenger situation. We've had worse." "You struck a passenger, Allison," Brandon reminded her, his voice low but intense. "A passenger whose skin color you've been making comments about since boarding. It's all on video from multiple angles." "Whose side are you on?" she hissed. "At this point, my own," Brandon replied bluntly. "I have a family and a mortgage." As the aircraft made its final approach, Vivian sat calmly in her seat, gazing out the window at the city below. Chicago had been central to her airline's growth strategy in the early 2000s, becoming their second-largest hub after Atlanta. The sprawling O'Hare terminals where her aircraft now prepared to land had an entire concourse bearing the Jackson name. James Whitaker, who had appointed himself Vivian's unofficial protector since the assault, leaned across the aisle again. "I don't mean to pry," he said quietly, "but I'm guessing we're about to witness something significant." Vivian smiled slightly. "Perhaps. I've worked in corporate America long enough to recognize when the wheels of accountability are turning unusually fast," James observed. "Someone very important must have taken an interest in what happened to you." "You could say that," Vivian acknowledged with characteristic understatement. The aircraft touched down smoothly, taxiing toward the gate with routine efficiency. As they approached, even passengers in the main cabin could see that something unusual awaited them. Beyond the standard ground crew, a group of people in business attire stood on the jet bridge, their expressions serious. "Look at the gate," a passenger several rows behind Vivian said loudly. "Are those news cameras?" Sure enough, through the terminal windows, the unmistakable shapes of television cameras were visible, their operators jostling for position near the gate area. Allison, who had been securing the galley for arrival, went pale at this observation. "News cameras," she repeated, her voice barely audible. "Why would there be news cameras?" Brandon had no answer for her. As the aircraft came to a stop at the gate and the engine spooled down, Captain Harris made one final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived at Gate C-17. As previously mentioned, we ask that all passengers remain seated. A representative from airline management will be boarding momentarily to make a special announcement. Thank you for your patience." The door to the jet bridge opened. First to board was a tall, distinguished-looking black man in his early 60s, wearing an impeccably tailored suit. Behind him came two younger executives and four members of airport security. Allison pressed herself against the galley wall, as if hoping to become invisible. Brandon stepped forward, attempting to maintain some semblance of professional protocol. "Welcome aboard, sir," he began, but the man walked past him without acknowledgement, his focus entirely on the first-class cabin. When he reached row 2, he stopped. For a moment, he simply looked at Vivian, genuine concern evident in his expression. Then, with a formality that immediately captured the attention of every passenger, he addressed her. "Ms. Jackson," he said, his deep voice carrying throughout the suddenly silent aircraft. "On behalf of the entire company, I want to express our profound apologies for what occurred on this flight today." A collective gasp swept through the cabin as the significance of his words registered. Heads turned, passengers craned their necks to see, and a buzz of whispered realization spread like wildfire. "Jackson, did he say Jackson? As in Jackson Aeronautics?" The man continued, either unaware of or indifferent to the sensation he had created. "I'm Philip Warren, CEO of Jackson Aeronautics. We've already begun a full investigation into this incident, and I assure you that appropriate action will be taken immediately." Allison Cooper, who had been trying to make herself invisible in the galley, now looked as though she might faint. The realization of exactly who she had slapped, not just an elderly black woman she had deemed unworthy of first class, but the founder, namesake, and majority owner of the entire airline, hit her with the force of a physical blow. "Ms. Jackson owns 60% of this airline," Philip continued, now addressing the entire aircraft. "She founded Jackson Aeronautics 43 years ago and has built it into the company that employs all of us today. That anyone on our staff would treat any passenger the way Ms. Jackson was treated is unacceptable. That it happened to the woman who created the very jobs we hold is beyond comprehension." Vivian finally spoke, her voice surprisingly gentle given the circumstances. "Thank you for coming personally, Philip, but this isn't just about me. If they treat the owner of the company this way, imagine how they treat passengers who don't have my resources or connections." Her words hung in the air, a powerful indictment not just of individual behavior but of systemic failure. Philip nodded soberly. "You're absolutely right, and that's why this incident will lead to comprehensive changes throughout our organization." Turning to the security personnel who had accompanied him, he added, "Please escort Ms. Cooper from the aircraft. Human Resources and Legal will meet with her immediately." Allison, who had remained frozen in shock since the revelation of Vivian's identity, suddenly found her voice. "I didn't know who she was," she protested as security approached. "How was I supposed to know?" It was James Whitaker who responded from his seat, his tone one of utter disbelief. "That's your defense? That you only physically assault passengers when you think they're ordinary people without power?" This observation seemed to land with several passengers, who nodded in agreement. Vivian herself remained composed, watching the scene unfold with the measured gaze of someone who had navigated complex situations throughout her long career. As security escorted a protesting Allison toward the exit, Vivian addressed her directly for the first time since the assault. "Ms. Cooper," she said, causing the procession to pause momentarily. "The issue isn't that you didn't recognize me. The issue is that you believed any passenger's race or appearance determined their worth and how they should be treated. That mindset has no place in my company." The simple dignity with which she delivered this assessment left Allison without reply. As she was led away, Brandon Matthews stood awkwardly in the galley, clearly uncertain about his own fate. Philip Warren turned to him next. "Mr. Matthews, as a supervisor who witnessed discriminatory behavior and failed to intervene, you'll also be meeting with Human Resources today." Brandon nodded numbly, his career aspirations visibly crumbling before the eyes of a planeful of witnesses. Throughout the main cabin, passengers sat in stunned silence, many recording the unprecedented scene on their phones. What had begun as a routine Wednesday flight had transformed into a dramatic revelation of hidden power and a public reckoning with discrimination. As Philip helped Vivian gather her belongings, preparing to escort her from the aircraft first, he leaned close and asked quietly, "Why didn't you tell us you were flying today? We would have ensured you received appropriate treatment." Vivian's reply, though quiet, carried enough to be heard by those in nearby seats. "And that's precisely why I didn't tell you, Philip. I needed to see how my airline treats passengers when they think no one important is watching." Now it was Philip's turn to have no response. As Vivian Jackson rose from her seat, the elderly woman in simple clothes who had been deemed unworthy of basic respect transformed before the eyes of every witness. Though her physical appearance hadn't changed, something in her bearing shifted, a quiet authority that had always been present but was now fully visible. She walked down the aisle with the confidence of someone who belonged everywhere she went, nodding graciously to passengers as she passed. Behind her, the whispers continued, as those who had witnessed corporate justice dispensed in real time tried to process what they had seen. And ahead of her, unbeknownst to most on the aircraft, a media firestorm was brewing that would transform not just one airline, but an entire industry's approach to discrimination. The scene that greeted Vivian as she emerged from the jet bridge into Chicago O'Hare's Terminal 3 was unprecedented. News crews jostled for position behind hastily established security cordons. Airline staff stood at attention, their expressions a mixture of anxiety and awe. And at the center of it all waited a medical team, ready to attend to the elderly victim of in-flight assault. "I don't need medical attention," Vivian stated firmly as a paramedic approached with a wheelchair. "Ms. Jackson, please," Philip Warren urged quietly. "You should at least have your cheek and arm examined." Vivian relented slightly. "I'll speak with them in the lounge, not here in front of cameras." Philip nodded to the security team, who created a path through the terminal toward the Jackson Aeronautics Premium Lounge. As they walked, Vivian could hear the murmurs of recognition from passengers and airport staff. For someone who had deliberately flown incognito, the sudden visibility was jarring, though she maintained her composure with practiced ease. Behind them, the remaining passengers from the flight were now deplaning, many immediately taking out their phones to share what they had witnessed. James Whitaker caught up to Vivian and Philip as they neared the lounge entrance. "Ms. Jackson," he called. "A moment, please." Vivian paused, turning to face the businessman who had attempted to intervene during the assault. "Mr. Whitaker. Thank you for your support during that unfortunate situation." James nodded, then extended a business card. "I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Horizon Innovations. We specialize in AI systems for corporate training and compliance monitoring. In light of what happened today, I believe our companies might have something to discuss." Vivian accepted the card, studying it briefly before tucking it into her purse. "An interesting suggestion, Mr. Whitaker. I'll have my team contact you." As James departed with a respectful nod, other passengers began approaching, many offering support or sharing their own stories of discrimination experienced on Jackson Aeronautics flights. "Last month, a flight attendant refused to help me with my bag because he said I wasn't dressed like I belonged in first class," a black woman in her 30s told Vivian. "I filed a complaint but never heard back. A gate agent made my elderly mother wait while they boarded all the white passengers in our group first," said another. "When I pointed it out, they threatened to have security remove us." Philip Warren listened to these accounts with growing dismay, making notes on his tablet. The airline executive, who had prided himself on running a progressive company, was confronting the reality that discrimination was far more pervasive than his reports had indicated. Inside the lounge, now cleared of other passengers for privacy, a doctor examined the bruise forming on Vivian's arm where Allison had grabbed her. Her cheek showed only slight redness, though the doctor noted that bruising might develop later. "You should press charges," the doctor advised. This was assault, plain and simple. Vivian shook her head. I'm more interested in systemic change than individual punishment. Firing one flight attendant doesn't solve the underlying problem. As the medical examination concluded, Philip updated Vivian on the immediate consequences already in motion. Allison Cooper has been terminated, effective immediately. Brandon Matthews is suspended pending investigation. We're reviewing all complaint records involving either of them for patterns of similar behavior. And Darius Johnson? Vivian inquired. The young man who offered to be a witness. Philip looked blank. I don't believe I've been briefed about him. Find him, Vivian instructed. He showed integrity when it was difficult to do so. That deserves recognition, not oversight. While they talked, Vivian's phone buzzed continuously with incoming calls and messages. Charles Bennett, her longtime legal counsel and friend, arrived at the lounge looking harried. It's everywhere, Viv, he reported, using the informal address that spoke to their decades of friendship. Every major news outlet, all over social media. The videos from the plane have gone viral. What's the narrative? Vivian asked pragmatically. Mostly accurate, actually. Airline founder experiences racism on her own plane. The footage speaks for itself. Philip looked increasingly uncomfortable. Our PR team is drafting a statement, but we wanted your approval before releasing anything. Vivian fixed him with a penetrating gaze. Philip, this isn't a PR problem. It's a culture problem. And based on what those passengers just told me in the terminal, it's far more widespread than today's incident. What are you suggesting? Philip asked cautiously. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm directing you, as the majority shareholder, to launch a comprehensive audit of every discrimination complaint filed against this airline in the past 5 years. I want to know how many were dismissed, how many were buried, and whether there are patterns involving specific employees or routes. Philip's expression revealed his surprise at the scope of this directive. That will be extensive. Yes, Vivian agreed simply. It will be. Charles Bennett was already making notes. I'll assemble a team from outside counsel to ensure impartiality. As they discussed next steps, Vivian's executive assistant, Diana Chen, arrived with Vivian's regular medication and a change of clothes. The board is requesting an emergency meeting, Diana reported. Several members are concerned about potential liability and stock impact. Vivian's expression hardened slightly. Schedule it for tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. sharp. Several indicated they wanted to meet today, Diana added hesitantly. Tomorrow, Vivian repeated firmly. I've had a rather trying day, as they may have heard. And I have research to do before I face them. While Diana coordinated logistics, Philip continued briefing Vivian on the unfolding situation with Allison Cooper. She's claiming union protection and threatening a wrongful termination suit, he explained. Her position is that she was never informed you would be on the flight and that your incognito status was a form of entrapment. Vivian actually laughed at this, a short, disbelieving sound. Does she believe assaulting any passenger would be acceptable if they weren't the company owner? Apparently her union representative is suggesting that very defense, Charles interjected, reading from his phone. They're claiming that while her behavior was regrettable, it wouldn't have resulted in termination if the passenger had been anyone else. Then they're making my point for me, Vivian replied. The issue isn't how staff treat VIPs. It's how they treat everyone. As the afternoon progressed, the consequences continued to ripple outward. Jackson Aeronautics stock dipped 3% in late trading as news of the incident spread. Social media exploded with #FlyingWhileBlack hashtags, as passengers shared their own experiences of discrimination on various airlines. And within the company itself, an increasingly panicked board of directors pressed for damage control. By evening, Vivian had relocated to her Chicago penthouse, where she continued working despite her doctor's recommendation to rest. As she reviewed historical complaint data that Diana had compiled, a disturbing pattern emerged. Complaints of racial discrimination filed by passengers of color were systematically categorized as customer dissatisfaction, rather than potential discrimination, a classification difference that meant they received less scrutiny and almost never resulted in disciplinary action. More troubling still, Vivian discovered that Allison Cooper had been the subject of 12 previous complaints regarding discriminatory behavior. All had been dismissed or downgraded by management, including several by Brandon Matthews himself. When Philip called for an update that evening, Vivian's tone was ice cold. "Explain to me, Philip, how a flight attendant with 12 discrimination complaints was still interacting with passengers." His hesitation spoke volumes. "I wasn't aware of that history. Those complaints must have been handled at the divisional level. Which means our systems for elevating serious issues are failing," Vivian concluded. "This isn't about one bad employee. It's about a culture that protects and enables discrimination." After the call ended, Vivian stood at her penthouse window, gazing out at the Chicago skyline illuminated against the night. The city where she had opened her first corporate office in 1982, fighting for financing when banks refused to take a black female entrepreneur seriously. The city where she had proven all the doubters wrong by building an airline that now employed over 42,000 people nationwide. Her phone chimed with an incoming message. It was from James Whitaker. "Ms. Jackson, I hope you're recovering from today's ordeal. I've taken the liberty of drafting a preliminary proposal for anti-bias monitoring technology that could help prevent similar incidents. Would welcome the opportunity to discuss further. Regardless, thank you for the grace with which you handled an inexcusable situation." Vivian read the message twice, then forwarded it to Diana with instructions to schedule a meeting. What had begun as a traumatic experience was already transforming into something potentially constructive, a catalyst for the very changes her airline so clearly needed. Outside her window, a Jackson Aeronautics plane took off from O'Hare, its lights visible as it climbed into the night sky. Vivian watched it until it disappeared into the darkness, thinking about the passengers on board and wondering about their experiences. Were they being treated with dignity? Or were some being subjected to the same discrimination she had faced? Tomorrow, she would begin finding out. And more importantly, she would begin fixing it, systematically, comprehensively, and without compromise. The consequences of one flight attendant's actions were still unfolding, but one thing was already clear. Jackson Aeronautics would never be the same. 1 week after the incident that had now been viewed online more than 20 million times, Vivian Jackson stood before the board of directors in the company's Atlanta headquarters. At 78, she still commanded the boardroom with the same authority she had wielded for decades, though the events of the past week had taken a visible toll. "The results of our preliminary audit are troubling," she began without preamble. "In the past 3 years alone, we've received over 800 complaints categorized as potential discrimination. Of those, only 11 resulted in any disciplinary action. The rest were dismissed, downgraded, or simply buried." The 14 board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Several began forming objections, but Vivian continued before they could interrupt. "More concerning still, our audit reveals that complaints were consistently reclassified to avoid triggering mandatory investigations. This wasn't individual misconduct. It was systematic evasion of our own policies." Harold Winters, the longest-serving board member besides Vivian herself, finally spoke up. "Vivian, while what happened to you was inexcusable, we need to maintain perspective. Every major airline deals with customer complaints, many of which are subjective or exaggerated." Vivian fixed him with a level gaze. "Is that your response, Harold? That we should dismiss discrimination complaints as exaggerations? That's not what I—" "It's precisely what you said," Vivian cut in. "And it exemplifies the attitude that created this problem. We've become so concerned with protecting the company that we've forgotten our responsibility to our passengers and employees." She advanced to the next slide in her presentation, which displayed a comprehensive anti-racism initiative that would transform every aspect of the airline's operations. "This is the Jackson Accountability and Inclusion Directive. It includes mandatory bias training for all 42,000 employees, revised hiring practices, new customer service protocols, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior with clear, immediate consequences. The chief financial officer, Melissa Gardner, looked alarmed. Vivian, the implementation costs for something this comprehensive would be astronomical. We're talking tens of millions in training alone, not to mention the operational disruptions. And what's the cost of continuing as we are? Vivian countered. The videos of my assault have been viewed 20 million times. Our stock is down 7%. Bookings have declined 12% in the past week. The financial cost of inaction already exceeds whatever we'll spend on this initiative. Despite her logical argument, Vivian could see resistance in the faces around the table. These were shrewd business people who had built successful careers by prioritizing profits and shareholder value. Most genuinely believed they weren't racist themselves and struggled to see how their company culture could be systematically biased. We need time to review this proposal, Harold suggested. Perhaps form a committee to evaluate implementation timelines and cost-effective alternatives. Vivian had anticipated this response. In fact, she had counted on it. There will be no committees and no delays, she stated firmly. As the majority shareholder of this company, I am instructing you to implement this directive in its entirety, effective immediately. The boardroom fell silent. While Vivian rarely exercised her controlling interest to override the board, everyone present knew she had both the legal right and the moral authority to do so. And if we determine that certain aspects are impractical or prohibitively expensive? Harold pressed. Vivian removed her reading glasses and placed them deliberately on the table. Then I will sell my controlling shares to someone who shares my commitment to creating an airline where every passenger is treated with equal dignity, regardless of the color of their skin. The threat hung in the air, its implications clear to everyone present. If Vivian Jackson sold her 60% stake in the company, everything would change: management, direction, perhaps even the company name itself. No one in that room wanted to preside over the dismantling of what they had helped build. That won't be necessary, Philip Warren intervened smoothly. The board recognizes the seriousness of this situation and the need for decisive action. We'll implement the directive as presented. Harold and several others looked as though they might object further, but the determination in Vivian's expression dissuaded them. They had seen that look before, typically right before she made business decisions that others deemed impossible but that ultimately proved visionary. With the board's reluctant acquiescence secured, Vivian moved forward with implementing the most comprehensive anti-discrimination initiative in the airline industry's history. Over the following weeks, Jackson Aeronautics became the center of a national conversation about corporate responsibility and racial justice. Diversity consultants were hired to overhaul training programs. Every employee, from baggage handlers to the CEO himself, was required to complete 40 hours of intensive bias training. Customer service protocols were rewritten to ensure consistent treatment regardless of race, appearance, or other factors that had previously influenced service quality. Most significantly, Vivian established a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination with clear, swift consequences. The policy applied equally to direct discrimination and to the failure to intervene when witnessing such behavior, addressing both the Allison Coopers and the Brandon Matthewses of the organization. Darius Johnson, the young flight attendant who had slipped Vivian his contact information during the fateful flight, was promoted to lead a newly created passenger advocacy department. His role involved both addressing individual complaints and identifying systemic issues that might otherwise go unnoticed. "You're giving me a lot of responsibility," Darius observed during his first meeting with Vivian in her Atlanta office. "I'm giving you the responsibility you've already demonstrated you can handle," Vivian corrected. "When everyone else on that flight crew chose to protect themselves or their colleague, you chose to stand for what was right. That's exactly the quality we need leading this department." Not everyone within the company embraced the changes. Some long-time employees resigned rather than adapt to the new standards. The pilots' union initially pushed back against some aspects of the training requirements, though they eventually conceded after Vivian personally addressed their leadership. The most vocal resistance came from Allison Cooper herself, who had retained a high-profile attorney to fight her termination. In press statements, she portrayed herself as a scapegoat, claiming she was being punished disproportionately for one mistake in 15 years of service. This narrative collapsed spectacularly when 3 former Jackson Aeronautics employees came forward with detailed accounts of Allison's pattern of discriminatory behavior. 1. A black former flight attendant named Tanya Williams, described being systematically excluded from premium cabin assignments by Allison, who had told her directly that certain passengers prefer attendants who look a certain way. As these stories emerged, former employees from throughout the company began sharing their own experiences of discrimination, creating a damning picture of a corporate culture that had tolerated racism for decades despite its black founder. "How did you not know?" a journalist asked Vivian during a CNN interview 3 weeks after the incident. "I knew discrimination existed in my company, just as it exists throughout our society," Vivian replied candidly. "What I failed to appreciate was how effectively our reporting systems were hiding the extent of the problem. I trusted processes that were fundamentally flawed." "Do you regret flying incognito that day?" the interviewer pressed. Vivian considered the question carefully before answering. "I regret that it took a public assault for me to fully understand what was happening in my own company. I regret that countless passengers experienced discrimination while flying with us. But no, I don't regret experiencing firsthand what others have endured. Sometimes we need to feel the sting ourselves before we truly understand the urgency of change." Beyond the confines of Jackson Aeronautics, Vivian's experience and subsequent actions were having industry-wide ripple effects. Other airlines, seeing both the public relations disaster and Vivian's resolute response, began proactively examining their own practices. 2 major competitors announced similar anti-discrimination initiatives within a month, though none matched the comprehensiveness of Jackson's approach. In partnership with James Whittaker's technology firm, Jackson Aeronautics began developing an innovative monitoring system that would identify potential discrimination in real time through pattern recognition. The system would flag unusual disparities in service delivery, allowing for immediate intervention before situations escalated. "We're not just fixing yesterday's problems," Vivian explained to shareholders during a special meeting. "We're building systems to prevent tomorrow's problems before they occur." By the 6-week mark, early data suggested the initiatives were having measurable impact. Customer satisfaction scores among passengers of color had improved by 22%. Employee feedback indicated greater awareness of unconscious bias and how it affected workplace interactions. And perhaps most tellingly, the number of discrimination-related complaints had actually increased, not because incidents had become more frequent, but because passengers now believed reporting would lead to meaningful action. Throughout this period of intense change, Vivian maintained regular contact with the various passengers who had witnessed her assault, particularly James Whittaker, whose technology expertise was proving invaluable. Their partnership, born from a discriminatory incident, was blossoming into an industry-changing collaboration. Not every consequence of the incident was positive, however. The stress of the public spotlight and the exhausting work of organizational transformation took a physical toll on Vivian. 6 weeks after the slap that had reverberated throughout the airline industry, she was hospitalized briefly for exhaustion and elevated blood pressure. "You need to pace yourself," her doctor advised. "Even you can't change an entire corporate culture overnight." "Watch me," Vivian replied with the determined smile that had carried her through decades of breaking barriers. The morning after her release from the hospital, Vivian called an unscheduled meeting with her executive team. As they gathered in the boardroom, uncertain what to expect, she made an announcement that caught even her closest advisors by surprise. "Starting next month, I'll be flying incognito on other major airlines," she informed them. "If they're experiencing similar issues, I want to understand them firsthand. And if they're doing things better than we are, I want to learn from them." Philip Warren looked alarmed. "After what happened last time, is that wise?" Vivian's expression remained resolute. "What happened last time is precisely why it's necessary. This isn't just about fixing Jackson Aeronautics. It's about changing an industry where discrimination has been normalized for too long. As her team departed, processing this latest development, Vivian remained at the boardroom table, gazing at the framed photographs on the wall, images chronicling the growth of her airline from a single leased aircraft in 1980 to the industry giant it had become. Each represented a barrier overcome, a challenge conquered. The latest challenge might be her most significant yet, but Vivian Jackson had never backed down from fighting for what was right. And she wasn't about to start now. 6 months after the slap that shook an industry, Vivian Jackson stood at the podium in Jackson Aeronautics' newly renovated training center, addressing the inaugural class of the Vivian Jackson Scholarship Program. 50 young people from underrepresented communities, all pursuing careers in aviation, looked back at her with expressions of hope and determination that reminded Vivian of herself at their age. "The path you've chosen isn't easy," she told them, her voice strong despite her recent health challenges. Aviation remains an industry where people of color, women, and other underrepresented groups face additional barriers. But today, those barriers are a little lower because someone had the courage to say, enough. In the 6 months since Vivian had experienced discrimination on her own airline, Jackson Aeronautics had undergone a transformation that industry analysts were calling unprecedented. What had begun as a PR nightmare had evolved into a case study in corporate responsibility and inclusive leadership. The comprehensive anti-racism initiative that Vivian had forced her reluctant board to adopt was now showing measurable results. Customer satisfaction scores had reached an all-time high across all demographic groups. Employee retention had improved by 11%. And perhaps most significantly, Jackson Aeronautics had become the industry leader in equitable customer service, as measured by independent evaluations. "When I started this airline 43 years ago," Vivian continued, addressing the scholarship recipients, "many people told me it couldn't be done. Not because starting an airline is difficult, though it certainly is, but because they couldn't imagine a black woman succeeding in this industry. Today, I want you to look around this room and understand something important: you belong here. Not as visitors or exceptions, but as the rightful future of aviation." Among those seated in the audience was Darius Johnson, now Director of Passenger Advocacy and Experience. In the months since the incident, Darius had built his department into a powerful force for change within the company. His team reviewed every discrimination complaint personally, ensuring that patterns were identified and addressed. More importantly, they worked proactively to create systems where such complaints would become increasingly rare. Beside him sat James Whitaker, whose technology partnership with Jackson Aeronautics had blossomed into something truly revolutionary. The AI monitoring system they had developed, now being tested in 3 major airports, could identify potential discrimination in real time by analyzing patterns in service delivery. When disparities were detected, supervisors received immediate alerts, allowing for intervention before situations escalated. As Vivian concluded her address and the scholarship recipients moved to the reception area, James approached her with evident excitement. "The early data from the monitoring system is exceeding our expectations," he reported. "We're identifying potential issues 28% more effectively than traditional reporting methods, and the real-time intervention has prevented at least 24 escalations in the past month alone." Vivian nodded with satisfaction. Technology isn't the whole solution, but it's an important tool in creating accountability. Speaking of accountability, James continued, his expression shifting to something more contemplative, "I saw Allison Cooper yesterday." Vivian raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Oh. She's working for Midwest Regional now," James explained. "And here's the irony, they just implemented their own version of your anti-bias training program. She was in the first mandatory session." There was a certain poetic justice in this that Vivian appreciated, though she took no personal pleasure in Allison's situation. "Perhaps she'll learn something this time." "That's just it," James said. "According to my contact there, she actually approached the trainer afterward with questions. It might be wishful thinking, but there's a possibility that experiencing consequences has opened her to reflection." Vivian considered this. Throughout her career, she had seen how systemic problems required systemic solutions, but individual transformation remained possible. I hope that's true, not just for her but for everyone who's been part of the problem without recognizing it. As they moved through the reception, Vivian was approached by a young black woman who introduced herself as Tara Jackson, no relation, a recent aeronautical engineering graduate. "Ms. Jackson, your airline was the only one that interviewed me after I graduated," she said. "The others all said they had no suitable openings despite advertising positions I was qualified for. Because of your new hiring practices, I got a fair chance. I start in the engineering department next month." Stories like Tara's had become increasingly common as Jackson Aeronautics implemented blind resume reviews and diverse interview panels. The transformation wasn't just affecting passengers, it was creating opportunities throughout the organization. Later that afternoon, Vivian met with Philip Warren and the board of directors for their monthly review of the anti-racism initiative. The atmosphere in the boardroom had evolved considerably since their contentious meeting 6 months earlier. "The numbers speak for themselves," Philip reported, displaying a slide that showed Jackson Aeronautics outperforming competitors across multiple metrics. Customer satisfaction up 26%. Employee engagement improved 18%. And, this is particularly noteworthy, our stock has not only recovered from the initial drop but is trading 12% higher than before the incident. Harold Winters, who had been among the most resistant to the changes, nodded grudgingly. "I'll admit I was skeptical, Vivian. The costs seemed prohibitive. But the return on investment has been undeniable." "This was never primarily about ROI, Harold," Vivian reminded him gently. "It was about doing what's right. The fact that it's also good business is a welcome bonus, but not the primary motivation." The meeting continued with updates on various aspects of the initiative. Mandatory bias training had been completed by 97% of employees. The zero-tolerance policy had resulted in 34 terminations and 62 formal reprimands, but the rate of incidents was decreasing monthly as the culture shifted. And perhaps most encouragingly, the company's recruitment of diverse candidates had increased by 41%. As the board meeting concluded, Vivian shared one final piece of news. "I've been invited to speak at the International Aviation Conference next month. The topic is, Transforming Corporate Culture, the Business Case for Inclusion. Several major airlines have requested private meetings afterward." Philip smiled. "From victim to industry leader in 6 months. Only you could manage that transformation, Vivian." "No," she corrected him firmly. "Not only me. This has been the work of thousands of people who recognized that change was necessary and were willing to do the uncomfortable work of making it happen. I just provided the catalyst." After the meeting, Vivian returned to her office to find Darius waiting with another update on their mentorship program. The initiative, which paired minority employees with senior leaders for career development, had already led to several internal promotions. "We've had requests from 3 other airlines to share our mentorship framework," Darius reported. "They're seeing our retention results and want to implement similar programs." Vivian nodded with satisfaction. "Share everything. This isn't about competitive advantage, it's about industry-wide transformation." As evening approached, Vivian prepared to leave for the day. Diana Chin entered with a final update. "The university called about your commencement address next week," Diana informed her. "They're expecting record attendance." "Thank you, Diana," Vivian replied. "And have we confirmed my flight arrangements for the incognito assessment of United next month?" Diana nodded. "Everything's arranged under your maiden name, as requested. Though after all the publicity, I'm not sure how incognito you can really be anymore." Vivian smiled. "You'd be surprised how invisible an old black woman can be when people aren't paying attention. But perhaps that's changing too." As she gathered her things to leave, Vivian paused at her office window, watching a Jackson Aeronautics plane take off from the runway below. Its livery now included a subtle addition, a thin multicolored stripe representing diversity and inclusion, added during the company's recent rebranding. The past 6 months had been challenging, exhausting, and occasionally painful. But as Vivian reflected on the transformation sparked by that single moment of discrimination, a transformation that was now spreading throughout the industry, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. What had begun as a humiliating assault had catalyzed changes that would impact millions of passengers and tens of thousands of employees. The slap intended to put her in her place had instead created a movement that was redefining what aviation could be, an industry where everyone was treated with equal dignity, regardless of appearance, background, or perceived status. As she turned to leave, Vivian's eye caught the framed photo on her desk, a new edition showing her surrounded by the first class of scholarship recipients. Their faces reflected hope, determination, and a future where they wouldn't have to fly incognito to ensure fair treatment. And in that moment, Vivian Jackson knew that while the incident 6 months ago had left a temporary mark on her cheek, the response to it would leave a permanent mark on an entire industry. Has discrimination ever affected your travel experiences? Have you witnessed or experienced similar treatment on an airline? Comment below with your stories. If this video made you think differently about how we treat others, hit that like button and subscribe to see more stories of justice and transformation. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that appearances don't determine a person's worth or power. Thank you for watching, and remember, change begins when we refuse to accept discrimination as normal, whether we're the target or a witness. Safe travels, everyone. This powerful story reminds us that discrimination often hides in plain sight, even in organizations founded by those who have experienced it firsthand. True change requires more than good intentions, it demands vigilant oversight, accountability at all levels, and the courage to experience reality without the shield of privilege. Vivian Jackson discovered that systems designed to report discrimination can actually conceal it when those in power prioritize appearance over substance. The most profound transformation came not from punishing one individual, but from rebuilding an entire culture. By implementing comprehensive training, zero-tolerance policies, and innovative monitoring systems, Jackson Aeronautics addressed both individual bias and institutional barriers. Perhaps most importantly, this story teaches us that meaningful change often begins with uncomfortable truths. It took Vivian experiencing discrimination personally to fully comprehend its pervasiveness in her company. Sometimes we must feel the sting ourselves before understanding the urgency of action. Real progress happens when those with power use it to elevate others, creating spaces where everyone is treated with equal dignity regardless of appearance or background. Has discrimination ever affected your travel experiences? Have you witnessed similar treatment on public transportation or in customer service? Share your story in the comments below, your voice matters in this important conversation. If this story made you reflect on how we judge others based on appearance, hit that like button to help spread this message further. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories about justice, resilience, and transformation that need to be told. Would you have handled this situation differently if you were in Vivian's position? Or if you witnessed such discrimination as a bystander like James? Let us know your thoughts. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that appearances don't determine a person's worth or power. Thank you for watching, and remember, change begins when we refuse to accept discrimination as normal, whether we're the target or a witness. Together, we can create a more equitable world.